Okay, Homegrown National Park. What is it? Why did we come up with this idea? What do we hope to accomplish? We will talk about that, but before we do that, let me ask you what this is. I think it looks like a fecal sac. Now, you know, birds don't want their babies to poop in the nest, so they've evolved this little sac, and the babies put the poops in the sac, and the parents pick it up and fly out, and then they drop it and go splat on a leaf. Now, nothing wants to eat a fecal sac, so if you mimic that, you're probably pretty safe. It's not a fecal sac, it's actually a spider, a boa spider, and at night it looks like a real spider. It hangs from a leaf, and it drops a single strand of silk, puts one sticky glob of glue at the end there, and then it goes hunting. Now, you wouldn't think it would catch anything with one target. A web would be a better idea, but it does. Moths fly in, they get stuck on that little target. She spins them around, wraps them up in silk very quickly, and then she has a nice meal, and then she cuts it loose. Then she goes hunting again, and she catches another moth, and then she cuts that loose. Then she catches another moth. And after she's gotten enough energy, she creates an egg mass. So all the eggs are in this little silken container here, and that's how they spend the winter. They hang from an egg mass, and if hunting's really good, she'll make 2 or 3 egg masses and hang them right in a row. Now, the real question is, why are moths flying into that single target? And it turns out it's not an accident. She is releasing the sex pheromone of particular species of moths. So all the moths that fly in there are males, thinking that she's a female. She is, but she's the wrong species. And I want to know what the species of moth in my yard was being attracted to the boa spider in my yard. So I unwrapped the little bodies underneath her, and it turned out it was the bronze cutworm. And I have bronze cutworm males, because I've got bronze cutworm caterpillars, and I've got bronze cutworm caterpillars because I've got goldenrod, which is their primary host plant. I also have this beautiful moth, the dot-line white, because I have oak trees, primarily white oaks, and because I don't rake the leaves away from underneath those trees. There is a dot-line white cocoon in that leaf litter. Do you see it? Right there. There it is up close, but you know, you would never see it when you're raking leaves. So keep in mind, when you rake your leaves away, you're raking away lots of living things. I also have evening primrose moths because I planted evening primrose to attract that moth. The moth did come, it spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but it's always very cute. I also have zebra swallowtails because we planted pawpaw specifically to attract them. That is the only host plant for the zebra swallowtail caterpillar. As a matter of fact, it would take me a long time to describe all the species that have come to our house, our property. It would not take me very long to describe what is living on a typical residential landscape like this, because they don't have any goldenrod, so they don't have any bronze cutworms, so they don't have any boa spiders. They don't have any oak trees, so they don't have any dot-line whites. Don't have any evening primrose, so they don't have evening primrose moth. They don't have pawpaws, so they don't have zebra swallowtails. There's very little that can live in a typical residential landscape, and we've got 135 million acres of typical residential landscapes in the U.S., which is 5 times larger than all the land managed by the National Park Service. And we're not finished. We're still developing 800,000 new acres of natural areas every single year. And it's one of the reasons we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. Talking about global insect decline. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. And if you are not a billionaire, let me remind you, a billion is 1,000 million. So we've lost 3,000 million birds in the last 50 years. 22% decline in our butterflies just since the year 2000. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife is gone. 40% of Earth's plants face extinction. The UN is predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. And they made that prediction 3 years ago. That's a prediction. That hasn't happened yet, and we have to be very sure it doesn't happen, because those are the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. But if you add all that up, it allows Elizabeth Kolbert to write this book, The Sixth Extinction, talking about the 6th great extinction event that has ever occurred on this planet. But this is the first one to be caused by a living being. Now, these statistics come out, and I've actually been surprised and pleased at the public's reaction to them, because I didn't think people cared. I really didn't think. But it turns out we do care, so much that scientists are actually studying our reaction to the loss of biodiversity. And one of those scientists is Richard Hobbs. And he thinks our reaction is very similar to the 5 stages of grief that we experience when we hear we have a terminal disease. Stage 1 is denial. We certainly have a lot of denial out there. Anger, at stage 2, I felt that. I think probably you have too. Bargaining, maybe it's not so bad, we can do something. Depression, I think we've all felt that. And then stage 5 is acceptance. And this is where we have to push back with rigor, because acceptance is the same as giving up. And giving up is not an option. We cannot give up on the natural world that supports us. So we're going to change stage 5 to action. There actually are things we can do to turn this around. And we do have parks, we do have preserves. Our national parks in particular were established primarily because they were really pretty places. And Teddy Roosevelt, of course, had a lot to do with that. This is what he said. He said, the establishment of the National Park Service is justified by considerations of good administration. So Teddy was patting himself on the back. It's okay. Of the value of natural beauty as a national asset, and of the effectiveness of outdoor life and recreation in the production of good citizenship. In other words, our parks were created because they were pretty places for us to play in. They were not created with the idea of conservation in mind. And that's one of the reasons we only have 3.6% of the U.S. in the national park system. Only 12% is federally protected, and that ranks behind a lot of other countries. But we do have those parks. We've got land conservancies, and they're scattered all over the place. So people wonder, why are they not enough to sustain the biodiversity that we need? And that is a good question. And there are actually several answers to that question, but the most important one is that these places are too small. Even our largest parks are too small. When you take a large area like that and you shrink it down to a little habitat fragment, and that's an exaggeration, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small populations. And that's the problem. Small populations are highly vulnerable to local extinction. Why? Because all populations fluctuate. In good times they go up, and bad times they go down. If you're a large population, this top line here, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals who, when times get better, you can increase very quickly. But if you're a tiny population, often in your normal cycles, you hit 0. You blink out of your little habitat fragment, and then you're gone. And unless you recolonize that fragment, you're permanently gone, which is called local extinction. And our parks are now so separated that recolonizing is much harder than it used to be. Imagine a box turtle crossing Route 95. Not going to happen. And there are studies all over the world, some of them quite long, more than 100 years in length, that are telling us the same thing. We have not preserved enough of the natural world to sustain the amount of nature that we need, the nature that sustains us. We tend to use extinction as a measure of trouble, but I don't like that because that's like going to the doctor when you're dead. It is too late. So I think a bigger measure is what we call defaunation, the reduction in the abundance of the species that are actually running our ecosystems, the really common ones. And this is an example. That is the American chestnut. Of course, it was the dominant tree along the Appalachian crest from Maine all the way down to Georgia. And then shortly after the turn of the century, last century, we brought in the chestnut blight and essentially eliminated it. Now, it's not extinct. There are chestnuts here and there, little sprouts come up, but it's functionally extinct. It is no longer common enough to be performing the roles that it once performed, which were many roles in our eastern forests. Same story, the rusty patch bumblebee. Not long ago, it was one of the most common bumblebees in the entire country. Now, if you see one, it's a big deal, because they really are on the brink of extinction. I have never seen one. So they're not extinct, but they're functionally extinct. They're no longer performing the roles they once performed. I can tell the same story about with the American beaver. When Europeans came to North America, the hydrology of the entire country had been established by beavers. We essentially trapped them all out. Now they're not gone, there are a few here and there, and when they act like a beaver, we trap them and move them someplace else. So the hydrology of the country is still largely changed. This paper just came out a few weeks ago, talking about the bird declines that people have measured are not with our rare birds, they're with the most common birds, the birds that are helping to run our ecosystems. So defaunation is the real problem, that reduction in the abundance of the species that actually run our ecosystems. It is local, it is everywhere, and we tend not to notice it. And we tend not to notice it because of a phenomenon called shifting baseline. We tend to think that the way things were when we were kids is the way they've always been and the way they should be. None of us missed the passenger pigeon because it was extinct before any of us were born. So if we are born into a world that has already gone through defaunation, we think it is normal to go outside and hear nothing and see nothing moving, which means we're not going to do anything about it. So shifting baseline means that we're losing the biodiversity that sustains us and we don't even notice it. Edwin Wade Teal, decades ago, said we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It's the most basic common sense. So what should we do? Well, there's good news. There's good news. And one of the bits of good news is that the biodiversity crisis, we have two crises on this planet. We've got the climate crisis, of course, but we also have the biodiversity crisis. And if we didn't have the climate crisis, we would still have a biodiversity crisis. But it's part of the public discussion now, part of the global discussion. The UN has met at least 3 times to talk about this. This was from the meeting in Montreal a few years ago. Crucial negotiations to protect biodiversity are moving at a snail's pace. We are negotiating whether or not we're going to protect what keeps us alive on this planet. And if we decide we're going to protect it, the UN will pass some resolutions and we will ignore them. But they're talking about it. That's good news. How about if we think about what E.O. Wilson suggested we do? Now, I don't have to explain who E.O. Wilson was to you folks up here. He was a very important professor at Harvard. I'll do it anyway. He had an extremely long, productive career. You know, one of the greatest scientists we have ever produced in this country. And one of the things that was consistent throughout his long career was his love of life on planet Earth. And because he loved it, he tried to save it his entire career. And he wanted to save it not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet. Or life will disappear everywhere, and that includes humans. Very bold statement. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, it's a great idea. We just put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are in trouble can be in that half. We can be in the other half, and it'll be great. But half of terrestrial Earth is already claimed by some form of agriculture, and I don't see that diminishing anytime soon. And we've got 8.2 billion people in the other half, along with all of our hardscape, our airports, our detritus. We don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how are we going to realize E.O. Wilson's dream? That's really what this talk is about. And I think we can. But we need a new approach to conservation to do that. We have got to give up the idea that humans and nature cannot coexist. We've had that idea for a long, long time, but that's not going to work. Not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. So rather than just practicing conservation in pristine areas, we need to practice conservation over here. But there's nothing to conserve over there, which means we have to go beyond conservation into restoration. We have to put it back. We have to rebuild natural systems. And in order to do that, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every day, but thrive. Now, one of the problems that's frequently pointed out is habitat fragmentation. We do have viable habitats out there, but they're tiny and they're separated from each other, and there's fewer and fewer of them. So when you're a small population and you're not connected to another habitat, when animals and plants mate with each other in that habitat, it tends to be with close relatives. That's called inbreeding depression, and that causes serious genetic problems over time. So the suggestion is we build biological corridors that connect the isolated habitat fragments with each other so that plants and animals can move back and forth and relieve that issue of inbreeding depression. But you probably have noticed the main problem persists. There's still tiny populations. So when the populations fluctuate, they will still slowly disappear from those habitats. So I think what we need to do is not just build corridors, but we have to build viable habitat in between viable habitats. That's better. That's even better. And we're going to do that by putting the plants back. Now these lighter areas here would be where our major cities are and much of our agriculture. But these areas, where is that? That's where we live. That's where we work. It's where we play. It's private property. So to achieve this, we need a new attitude about property rights. We have this idea that we can own a piece of the earth. It's ours, and we have the right to do whatever we want with it. But here's the problem. Our yards are not like Las Vegas. You know that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Some of you know that, right? But what happens on our property does not stay on our property. That is the problem, because our properties, every property, is part of a local ecosystem. So whatever you do to it is going to impact that ecosystem either positively or negatively. Let's talk about what happens when we decide we're going to have a big lawn. Well, when it rains, that rain is going to either infiltrate, depending on the size of the lawn, or leave as stormwater runoff. And if it leaves as stormwater runoff, it's going to take all those things we put on the lawn with it. It's going to take the added nitrogen, the phosphorus, the herbicides, and the insecticides right into our local watershed. It's also going to determine how much carbon we're adding to the atmosphere every single Saturday when we mow that lawn. Your lawn is determining how well you're supporting local pollinators. If you have a lawn the way you're supposed to have a lawn, you're not supporting them at all. It is not pollinator habitat at all. You're also determining, when you decide what plants you're going to put on your property, how much carbon you're going to sequester, how much carbon you're going to pull out of the atmosphere and tie up in those plants. And then, of course, those plants are pumping extra carbon that they fix through photosynthesis into the ground through their root systems. They're doing that all the time. So you're determining how well you're going to help climate change. Your plant choices are also going to determine whether you're harboring ecological tumors, like calorie pear, that of course escape where we plant them, and then essentially castrate local ecosystems. Our plant choices are also going to determine how well we are supporting local food webs. If you choose the plants that actually share some of their energy, you're going to support the food web, but many of our plants do not. So how we landscape, how much lawn we have, and our plant choices are going to determine how much life our properties can sustain. And that is an awesome responsibility. And it's an awesome responsibility that most homeowners do not know they have. But it also creates a grassroots solution to the biodiversity crisis. There are millions of us out there. There are millions of property owners. There are millions of people who vote or should. We all can become conservationists with very little extra knowledge. Where are we going to do this? Well, we're going to start on private property. That is the property that you and I can start to manage immediately. And it's also most of the property that's out there. 78% of the lower 48 states is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So if we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail, and failure's not an option. So all this means that collectively, property owners are now the hope and the future of conservation. Let's return to lawn. It is the low-hanging fruit, and we got a lot of it. More than 44 million acres of lawn nationwide, which is an area bigger than all of New England combined, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. So why do we do that? Well, a couple of reasons. Lawn is a status symbol, a very deeply entrenched status symbol. We like neat, and it is easy to keep lawns neat. And we have to display our Halloween decorations. But what if we replanted half the area that's in lawn? I am not suggesting we get rid of lawn. It's the perfect plant to walk on. It's a wonderful cue for care. Shows your neighbor you really do understand what the local culture is. But we don't need 44 million acres of it. Let's cut it in half. Let's say we got 40 million acres. We'll make the math simple. Cut that in half. That'll give us 20 million acres that we can restore right at home, which is enough to create Homegrown National Park. How big is it? It's big. It's bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge. plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. And it is a real thing now. Got a small nonprofit, which focuses on the non part of the profit. Called homegrownnationalpark.org. You can go to our website and you can join Homegrown National Park. You can register your property on the biodiversity map. And by that we mean you put down your location and the amount of area you either are being a good steward of or you're going to be a good steward of. So maybe you really are going to cut the area of lawn. Even if you don't do it in half, maybe you're going to reduce it by 1 square foot. That's good enough, for starters. Maybe you're going to put an oak tree in your yard. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Doesn't matter how modest your actions are right now, but you put those data into the database, and your little piece of your county is going to light up with a firefly. That is our emblem. And you can look at your county and see how many other people have joined Homegrown National Park. And of course the goal is to get the entire country to light up with fireflies. Our mission is very simple. We want to motivate millions of people to regenerate biodiversity in the way that you regenerate biodiversity. By planting the native plants that support it, by removing the invasives and non-native plants that do not support it, and in so doing, building a culture that's sympathetic to the needs of conservation. This is where our national parks are right now. We want to turn that into that. It won't be that hard. What are Homegrown National Park's ecological products? There's some important ones. And one, of course, is a significant increase in biodiversity. I'll give you some examples of how well this works in a few minutes. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody removed the invasive plants just from their property, we'd be 78% done nationwide. We'd be 85% done in the East. Not completely done, but it's a real good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst sequesterer, worst plant in terms of sequestering carbon. So if you reduce the area of lawn and put other plants in there, you're going to help climate change. And you're also going to start to build viable habitat outside of protected areas. Any bit of conservation we do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. There are also really important sociological products from Homegrown National Park, and one is national awareness. Not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We really are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not just there for our entertainment, and it's not just there for the people who like it. It's essential for everybody, and because it's essential for everybody, everybody owns responsibility to sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge the existing conservation organizations that are out there, Audubon and National Wildlife Federation and Wild Ones and all the land conservancies. We want to get the good conservation that they are doing registered on the biodiversity map so we can see how we're really doing. You know, we've got this 30 by 30 initiative. It's a global initiative. We're going to save 30% of the earth by 2030, 30% of the US by 2030. Not if we don't count the good conservation that's happening on private property. And right now, nobody's doing that. So when we fill out that biodiversity map, we'll also see where there's some serious gaps where we have to work a little bit harder. If we're going to change that into that, we have to change that into that. That is my mother-in-law's old house. And when they built that, not that long ago, it was a cornfield. So conservation happens, and it happens much faster than we think. Did I mention Homegrown National Park is free? Which is why we need money. We're not trying to compete with other conservation organizations. We're not trying to drag you away from the organization you already belong to. We just want to record the good conservation that is happening in those other organizations. And Canada has now joined us. We're actually talking to England. I mean, we're really talking about a global initiative here. But we're tiny. We don't have that many people. There's urgency in enacting the Homegrown National Park solution. Remember that 135 million acres? That's in residential landscapes. It's a big job. So we all need to get to work, but we all need to clearly understand what it is we have to do. What do we need to know in order to succeed? Well, there are 4 ecological responsibilities that every single landscape out there has. Every landscape needs to support a viable food web. Every landscape needs to sequester carbon, pull carbon out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, tie it up in plants, and pump that extra carbon into the soil. Every landscape has to manage the watershed in which it lies, and every landscape has to support pollinators. Lawn does none of those things, which is why I pick on it all the time. We have to really internalize how important plant choice is. This, of course, is burning bush, a pretty plant if you like red. But in New England here, very serious invasive plant. There are 3 kinds of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs, plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and plants that actively remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of our oaks. We've got 91 species of oaks in this country, and they're contributing more energy to local food webs than any other plant genus by far. A good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo biloba from Asia, or any of our ornamental plants from Asia. It's a pretty ornament, turns nice yellow in the fall, but nothing eats a ginkgo, so it's not adding any energy to the local food web. And a good example of a detractor would be any of the invasive plants that we have brought in, that not only are they not contributing energy, they're pushing out the native plants that do contribute energy to our local food web. So there's a net loss of energy from that food web. We have to start to appreciate how important caterpillars are. Now, we all grew up thinking, a caterpillar's a worm, and if you see it, you have to squish it. Well, that's completely wrong. It turns out they are the meat and potatoes of terrestrial food webs. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we will have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. Which is why I talk about keystone plants, because those are the plants that support the most caterpillars. Remember what a keystone is? It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And when you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. They are supporting the most caterpillars. As a matter of fact, just 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up, the support system. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. How do you know what the best keystone plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the most important woody plants and herbaceous plants in your county will pop up. That's an abbreviated list because I ran out of room. Point here is that the old excuse of not knowing what to plant is just an excuse now. You go to Native Plant Finder and you do know what to plant. We have to talk about why native plants are so much better at supporting caterpillars and other insects than the non-natives. We mention that all the time, but we really need to dig into it. The reason is that plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they have protected their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals. Secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. Which means most of the plants out there are protected from most of the insects out there. But insects do eat plants, and they do that by specializing on one or two particular plant lineages. They get good at getting around the chemical defenses of those lineages. And 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They have developed particular enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of evolutionary history interacting with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So let's look at the monarch butterfly as an example, because we know a lot about the monarch butterfly. Most people know that it is a host plant specialist on milkweeds. And most people know that milkweeds are toxic plants. They're filled with cardiac glycosides. If you're into eating plants out there, don't eat a milkweed. If you eat enough milkweed, it will stop your heart. I used to say it would give you a heart attack, but there was a physician in the audience who said, no, it will stop your heart. And they also are filled with sticky latex out. That's what gives milkweeds their name. That, of course, is the white goo that gets on your fingers if you break open a milkweed leaf, and usually wipe it off right away. But if you don't, if you let it sit in your finger for a few minutes, when it's exposed to oxygen, it gels. It turns into a chewing gum-like substance, and that's its defensive compounds. If a caterpillar gets that smeared on its mouth, it glues its mouth shut, and the caterpillar starves to death. So there's a big question. We know that monarch caterpillars eat milkweed. How do they do that without gluing their mouth parts shut? Well, this is something you can watch right in your yard. Just plant a milkweed, the common milkweed. Asclepias syriaca is a really good choice in this case. The caterpillar will walk onto the leaf. It goes typically to the end of the leaf, and it starts to eat. And if any latex sap starts to come out at all, it will stop eating immediately, turn around, go back up the leaf, maybe 2/3 of the way, and it starts to chew. And it chews and it chews. It's chewing through the midrib. And it chews until it has completely severed the midrib, which means it has blocked the flow from latex sap from this part of the leaf to this part of the leaf. So now this part of the leaf is latex free. It can turn around and go back down, and it can eat the leaf without any latex sap coming out at all. And because they chew through the midrib, it ends up their body weight flags the leaf. So if you are a monarch hunter, you can drive down the road, look at a milkweed patch, and if there are any flagged leaves, you know that you have monarchs there. So that's the upside of specialization. Monarchs get to use a plant that most other insects cannot use. They've got the physiology and the behavior to get around milkweed defenses. The downside of specialization is that now that's all monarchs can eat. We've got 2,137 plant genera in North America, native plant genera, and monarchs can only eat one of them. That is host plant specialization, and monarchs are they're not special. They are not unique. 90% of our insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like the monarch. So if we take away the plants they have specialized on, we lose all of those insects. And that's one of the things we've been measuring in my lab at the University of Delaware. What happens when we do allow non-native plants that our insects have not adapted to replace the natives that they have adapted to, either in our yards or in our natural areas. And this is one simple experiment I did with an undergraduate a few years ago. We went into hedgerows in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware that were either invaded with non-natives, so there's a lot of autumn olive there, and multiflora rose, and oriental bittersweet, and bush honeysuckle, and Japanese honeysuckle, and so on. And compared the caterpillar populations in a standardized way in those hedgerows with hedgerows that were not invaded at all. The real trick was finding hedgerows that weren't invaded. But we did. We found a 68% reduction in the number of species of caterpillars in the invaded hedgerows, a 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars, and a 96% reduction in the biomass of those caterpillars, the amount of energy those caterpillars were adding to those hedgerows. So if you think of caterpillars as bird food, you've just reduced bird food by 96%. Now, there are a lot of reasons our birds are in trouble, but starving them is one of them. We also have to think very carefully about all those things that E.O. Wilson told us. Now, he's gone, but he wrote a lot. It's all still out there. One of the things he said way back in 1987 was that insects are the little things that run the world. And the point of that paper was, again, very simple. Life as we know it depends on insects, and if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, it would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. We would lose our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because it would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. Now, we've gotten pretty good at recognizing the importance of pollinators. We need pollinators. The reason you hear we need pollinators is a little bit off. We need them everywhere. You hear that we need pollinators because they pollinate 1/3 of our crops. It's actually about 1/12 of our crops. And I've heard people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they're pollinating 80% of all plants, some of which are our crops, and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that is not an option. we have to start to appreciate how important the leaves that fall from our trees every year are. There are three main reasons why we have to keep all the leaves that fall on our property. To think of them as if they're rainwater. We're going to keep all the rain on our property. And those three reasons are this. First, they protect the soil moisture. A lot of species live in the soil. As a matter of fact, more species live in the soil than above the ground, and they all require high humidity. And leaves are protecting the ground, particularly during periods of drought, so that all those creatures don't die. Leaves are recycling the nutrients. All the nutrients your tree used this year are in the leaves that they have dropped. If we don't get those nutrients back into the soil, in future years, your tree will have nothing to grow with. So it completes the nutrient cycle. And leaves, of course, house an awful lot of animal species. Now, the reason we worry about our leaves is that, first of all, they'll hurt our lawn, but remember, we're going to have less lawn. And we're worried that our flowering plants, our bed plants, won't be able to get through those leaves. But who was raking the leaves before we got here? And there were plants in North America. I read about it. Our plants are much better at getting through normal layers of leaf litter than we think they are. So this is under shingle oak in my yard. These are little violets coming up. I didn't rake any of those leaves. There they are in the beginning. Here they are pushing a little farther through, a little farther, and in the end they're totally up, happy, never break any of those leaves, and they're delicate little plants. And I'm actually making a list of all the plants on our property that don't need to have leaves raked, and it's a big list now. We need to appreciate how important light pollution is in this global insect decline crisis that we have. Light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines, and these are all the ways that lights are killing our insects at night, particularly the moths that are creating the caterpillars that run our food web. It is a very serious environmental problem that has a really simple solution. We could turn those lights out. Believe it or not, we really could. But I know you're worried about the bad man. So you could put a motion sensor on your light, so it only turns on when the bad man does come, which is not that often. Or even easier, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. You can go to the hardware store tomorrow and buy what they call a bug light. Sounds like it's going to kill your bugs, but no, it's actually going to save them. Either incandescent or LEDs. And a recent study came out saying the LEDs are actually the best in terms of not attracting insects. The key here is that nocturnal insects are not attracted to yellow wavelengths. So it's that simple. Just produce yellow wavelengths. If we were to take our white bulbs out of our security lights overnight and replace them with yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we use those LEDs, we would save millions of dollars as well. I have to talk about mosquito fogging. I'm sure you don't do that up here, but it's a booming business around the country. And why wouldn't you do it? They say, well, this is a natural, organic product that we are fogging, and it only kills mosquitoes. And if that were true, I would hire them too. But it's not true. Natural and organic, maybe. It is pyrethroids. That's the same compound that's made in chrysanthemum. It's industrial strength pyrethroids. It's made in chrysanthemums to kill insects. Natural and organic. You know, cyanide is natural and organic. Ricin is natural and organic. So being natural and organic says nothing about its toxicity. Only kills mosquitoes. Tell these poor monarchs. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with. You cannot make an insecticide, a generalized insecticide that only kills one species without killing everything else. This was the result of a mosquito fogging event on Kent Island in the Chesapeake a few years ago. My friend happened to be there and he picked up a handful of monarchs, but he said there were thousands on the ground because it was during a major migration event. The interesting thing is it doesn't control mosquitoes. We're doing this for nothing. In order to control mosquitoes, in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of them. These guys kill between about 40%, so they have to keep coming back and back, making sure your monarch is really dead. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it in the larval stage. And you can do it right at home using mosquito dunks. This is biocontrol. What you do is you get a bucket and you fill it full of water and you put in a handful of straw or hay or dead leaves, some kind of organic material, put it out in the sun for a few days, and you're going to build up the population of diatoms and algae. And that is what mosquito larvae eat. So that becomes an irresistible brood to any female mosquito that's in your yard. She will lay her eggs in your bucket. Then you go to the hardware store and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunce. That's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So the beauty of this is it's targeted. It's only going to kill what you want to kill. It's also cheap, $12 for a season's worth of control. And it's also something you can do right at home. And if everybody did it, it really would help control our mosquitoes. We have to start to appreciate how important small properties can be in conservation. 82% of us live in cities with either small properties or essentially no property, just a front foundation planting. This is actually a friend of ours. Those are wood poppies and violets, very simple planting, but they're all native. Or if you have no land at all, you can do container gardening, which can be really effective in terms of supporting particularly local pollinators. Now let's say you live in an apartment complex. Right now, ecologically, it's a pile of bricks. But what if everybody did container gardening on their balcony? And I mean everybody. It would be a valuable resource now to the migrating monarch, to all of the pollinators that are in our cities. And there are a number of pollinators in our cities doing the best they can. If you want to know what the best native plants are for containers, that is on our website now, homegrownnationalpark.org. Just go to the website and it will tell you the best native plants in containers for your ecoregion, because it changes as you move around the country. Now, fortunately, we do have a silver bullet in our fight against climate change and biodiversity crisis, the two major crises on our planet, and they both can be addressed by conservation. And fortunately, conservation works. It really does. This is the Nachusa grasslands in Illinois. 3,800 acres, more than 730 native plant species there, over 180 species of birds use this place. It used to be a cornfield. So nature is resilient. This is Mentor Marsh in Ohio. It was the largest stand of Phragmites, a common reed, the Phragmites invasive one from Europe. The largest stand in Ohio was 800 acres of Phragmites. Well, they control it. It is now 800 acres of a vibrant freshwater marsh, supporting several species of freshwater plants that are state listed. Another huge success. This is Sibley Ridge Park in California. A man by the name of Glenn Schneider leads a small band of volunteers up to that park every weekend. They each have a little hand whacker and a bottle of vinegar. And they get on their hands and knees. Now the green back here, those are all invasive grasses that were brought in for the cattle. The cattle are gone from this area, but those grasses have spread over most of California at this point. So they get on their hands and knees, they whack out the grass, they spray it with their vinegar, and look what comes up. They didn't plant that stuff. That's the seed bank. So amazing recovery when you remove those invasives. And this is where Cindy and I live. This is where we moved in the year 2000. It was a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots. We got one of those lots. Very old farm, been farmed for more than 300 years. And the last thing they did before they sold the property was to mow it for hay. So there were very few plants there, very few native plants there. When you mow for hay in southeast Pennsylvania where we live, you're really mowing the rootstocks of autumn olive and multiflora rose and oriole bittersweet, all of those invasive plants from Asia. You can call it hay because they sell it to the mushroom industry and they don't care what it is as long as it's organic. But when you stop mowing, mowing does not kill the root system. So when you stop mowing, and it was out of mowing 3 years before we actually moved in, that's what comes back. We ended up with 10 acres of invasive vines and shrubs from Asia. We couldn't even walk around the property. So the first thing we did was cut trails. But you're not going to restore this property until you get rid of those things. And I don't want to minimize how much work it is, but it is much easier when you get your spouse to do it. And when she's finished, you can put the plants back, which we have done. So the question is, has life returned? Now you measure life any way you want. We measure it in two ways. The breeding birds, the species that have bred successfully on our property, and the number of moth species that I have found on our property. Moths, not butterflies. Butterflies are just bad-tasting, day-flying moths. They really are. They come right out in the middle of the moth phylogeny. And because they taste bad, they can fly during the day, and most birds leave them alone. So they don't contribute a lot to local food webs. So we just count the moths, and I have been doing that, I keep saying 8 years, but it's probably 9 years now. I'm still at it because I keep getting new ones, but I'm up to 1,349 species of moths that are at our house now because we put the plants back. And many of them are really cool, like the chinkapin leaf miner, the skullcap skeletonizer, the neighbor, they've got great names, the little devil, the horrid zalie, the forgotten frigid owlet, the obtuse yellow, the explicit arches, and yes, there is an implicit arches as well, the snowy-shouldered aclaris, the grateful midget, the morbid owlet, the pink-shaded fern moth, the feeble grass moth, the scribbler, the lemon plagotis, the three-patched bigwig, the cynical quaker, the showy emerald, the green marvel, Harris's three-spot, the confused wood grain, the slowpoke, tearful underwing, eyed pectes, the hog sphinx, the tufted bird dropping. Who wouldn't want the tufted bird dropping? This is my favorite, the spun glass caterpillar, and literally hundreds of other species have come to the plants on our property. And right away somebody says, well, how come you have any plants on your property? They're going to eat all your plants. Remember, caterpillars are the bread and butter, the meat and potatoes of terrestrial food webs. Everything is eating them. How about those birds? Those birds are eating, particularly during the breeding season, hundreds of caterpillars every single day per bird. And we have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our property. Not flew by, but bred. I am surprised I find any caterpillars for the number of birds there that are eating those caterpillars. We also have other insects that are eating caterpillars, and they're all controlling themselves. Things like the ambush bug and assassin bugs, predatory stink bugs. This guy sat next to this aggregation of milkweed tussock moths, and he ate one a day. And there were fewer after that. We've got a lot of parasitoid species, These are mostly are laying eggs in caterpillars, so tremendous control of caterpillars that way. We also have predatory wasps that they sting the caterpillar and carry it off to their nest, and then they lay an egg on it. This is nature's form of refrigeration. If they killed the caterpillar, it would rot before the egg even hatched. But when they sting it, they paralyze it, it's not dead, and then the egg can hatch and eat it alive. We also have vertebrates that are controlling our insects. We've got skunks, we've got possums, we've got raccoons, we've got foxes. 25% of a fox's diet is insects. And we have those amphibians. We've got spring peepers, we've got toads, we've got green frogs, we've got wood frogs. Wood frogs just joined our property last year. First time in, I guess, after 23 years, so that was a wonderful addition. We've got salamanders, we've got ringneck snakes, these are all insectivores, and we've got the cutest little gray tree frogs that are actually green when they're little. Now there's something that's common to all of these conservation approaches, and that is whether or not they work is going to depend on the decisions that you and I make every day. I had a student, Amanda Crandall, in my class a couple of years ago, and she wrote this as part of a final exam. She said, well, conservationists claim to be managing species and habitats. What we're actually managing is people. That is so true. We need to change our adversarial relationship with nature to a collaborative one. It's the only way forward in my view. And the question is, can we do this? Of course we can do this. You don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just think about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you focus. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. What can one person do? One person can do all the things we just talked about. They can shrink the lawn, can modify your lights, you can add a pollinator garden, you can remove your invasive plants, you can use keystone plants, you can fire Mosquito Joe, a whole bunch of things. And again, it shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. You become empowered. Robert Swan recently said the greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it. It's not going to be someone else, folks. It's going to be you. I'll help a little bit, but it's really going to be you. So I hope Homegrown National Park will provide the motivation, the guidance, and the community for millions of us to tackle these conservation challenges, because whether or not we do so today is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own. Thank you very much.